The wind spoke first. It curled around the edge of the old cabin like a warning, whispering through broken shingles and loose shutters. Ruth Candler paused mid-step, her arms full of chopped wood, and listened. No birdsong, no voices. Just the creak of old trees and the brittle sound of winter hanging on too long. In Grady's Hill, silence was rarely empty. It often meant eyes were watching. She pushed the door open with her shoulder, let the warmth from her fireplace kiss her cheeks, and dropped the wood by the hearth. Her joints ached from the cold. Her hands were cracked, her boots worn thin. Still, it was her cabin, her corner of the world. Ever since Jacob had died from the fever last spring, it was all she had, and even that was borrowed land. The bread had been cooling since dawn, a rough loaf made with coarse flour and what was left of the old lard tin. She didn't expect it to last. Nothing did anymore. She was about to cut it when something caught her eye, movement just beyond the frosted window pane. Ruth stepped closer, careful not to startle whatever it was. Behind the bare branches of the oak tree that framed her yard, she saw him. A boy. Thin, barefoot, no older than 10. His hair hung in tangled waves over his ears, and his face was half-shadowed beneath a fur-lined hood that had clearly seen better days. He crouched near the fence post, watching the cabin with the stillness of a wild animal. She knew what he was, not by the clothes, but by the markings on the necklace around his neck. Cherokee. Her first instinct was to reach for the rifle. Not because she wanted to use it, she didn't even know if it was loaded, but because that's what folks in town would have done. Don't trust them, old Pastor Lively had preached last winter. They watch from the trees, they wait for weakness. But Ruth didn't reach for the rifle. She reached for the bread. She opened the door slowly, the crusty loaf held in both hands. The boy flinched but didn't run. His eyes followed her every move, dark and sharp as obsidian. She stepped out onto the porch, ignoring the biting wind that whipped through her shawl. "I ain't got much," she said aloud, voice steady. "But if you're hungry, this'll do." She walked down the 3 porch steps and knelt, placing the bread carefully on a flat stone near the edge of the yard. Then she stood and backed away, slow, like coaxing a skittish deer. The boy didn't move, not for a long time. Then, quick as lightning, he darted forward, snatched the loaf, and vanished into the woods. Ruth exhaled, not realizing she'd been holding her breath. That night she didn't sleep well. Her dreams were full of hollow faces and burning cabins, of Jacob's last words, "People don't forgive what they fear," echoing over and over until she woke with a chill in her spine and sweat on her brow. She didn't know why she'd done it. Maybe it was the way the boy's ribs stuck out like broken fence slats. Maybe it was the way no one had ever brought her bread when Jacob died, when her firewood ran out and her chickens froze one by one. Or maybe it was just that she'd spent too many nights alone, and mercy, no matter how small, was the only thing that still made her feel human. In the morning, she found something on the porch, a small bundle of pine needles, tied with a strip of deer hide. Inside was a charm, 4 beads, white, red, black, and yellow, strung together with a carved feather. She didn't know what it meant, but it had been left with care. And somewhere deep inside her tired chest, something fluttered awake. Not fear, not regret, something softer. She held the charm against her palm and whispered, "Lord, what did I just start?" The wind didn't answer, but the trees were no longer silent. By mid-morning, the light had shifted. Ruth stood on the back step, shawl pulled tight across her shoulders, her breath visible in the cold air. The woods behind her cabin, usually quiet save for birds or squirrels, now felt heavy. She couldn't explain it, like something had settled over the land. Not a storm, not quite, but a presence. She told herself it was nothing, just nerves, just leftover worry from the night before. And then she saw them. 3 figures, standing still among the trees like statues carved from bark and shadow. Not hiding, no, watching. Elders. 2 men and a woman, all wrapped in heavy hides and woven cloaks. Their faces were solemn, unreadable, their hair braided with feathers and bone. They didn't speak, didn't move. They simply stood beneath the pines, eyes fixed on her cabin as if measuring it, measuring her. Ruth blinked hard, heart thudding in her chest. When she looked again, they were gone. She backed into the cabin and shut the door. Her hands shook as she lit the stove. She wasn't sure why the sight of them had unnerved her so deeply. They hadn't raised weapons, hadn't shouted, but it was their stillness that unsettled her. That ancient kind of quiet that didn't belong to the modern world. Not long. After she heard footsteps on the porch, she froze, fingers gripping the edge of the table. The door didn't open. No one knocked. But when she finally dared to peek outside, there was a bundle laid neatly on the step. Wood, split, stacked, and tied with a braided cord. Oak and pine, dry and clean. No note. No sound in the trees, just the gift. She didn't know what to make of it. The last time someone had chopped wood for her had been Jacob, and even then, it was rarely without muttering. She bent slowly, touched the cord. It was soft as thread, but sturdy, made by hand, carefully with time and skill. They came close, she whispered. That night, Ruth kept every lantern lit. She boiled potatoes with lard and prayed quietly before her meal, not out of habit, but out of need. "Lord," she murmured, "if this is your doing, show me how to walk through it without trembling." Outside, the wind stirred the trees like a breath through tall grass, the kind of wind that didn't howl, just whispered things you couldn't quite understand. At some point, she dozed in her chair by the fire, and in her sleep, she dreamed of the boy again. Only this time, he wasn't starving. He stood beside the tallest of the elders, wearing a tunic of deer hide and holding a piece of bread in one hand, a stone in the other. He didn't speak in the dream, but his eyes said something she couldn't shake. "You were the first." She awoke to the sound of something soft landing on the roof, pine cones maybe, or snowmelt dripping through cracks. The fire had gone low. And on the windowsill, placed neatly on the inside, was the charm from yesterday, but it had changed. Now 5 beads. The new one was blue. She hadn't put it there, and her cabin door was still locked. Ruth pressed her hand to the window pane and stared out into the dark woods beyond. For the first time since Jacob's death, she didn't feel alone. But that wasn't comfort. It was warning. The town hadn't changed. Same warped wooden signs. Same dusty storefronts with their chipped paint and sagging porches. Same eyes watching every step Ruth Candler took from behind curtain slits and rocking chairs. But something had shifted. It was in the way folks stepped aside as she passed. Too quickly, too silently. In the way the chatter at the general store died before she even touched the door. In the way the preacher's wife looked right through her, like Ruth had turned invisible. Or worse, like she'd turned unclean. She walked slower than usual, holding her basket close. The cobbler nodded stiffly but said nothing. Mr. Hemley, who'd once delivered flour to her porch in the hard winters, pretended to fumble with a crate. And when she stepped inside the store, the temperature dropped 10 degrees. 3 men stood by the counter. Ranchers, heavy-set, the kind who always smelled like sweat and chewing tobacco. One had a scar down the side of his neck. Another wore a belt with bullets even though the nearest trouble was 20 miles south. They looked at her like she'd just tracked mud through a church. "Well, if it ain't the redskin nurse," one said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Ruth didn't flinch. She walked to the back wall, collected a sack of oats and a bar of soap, and turned to face the clerk. 2 bits, she said evenly. The man behind the counter didn't move. "You hear what folks are saying, Ruth?" She kept her gaze level. "I've heard what they think they saw." The third man chuckled. "Heard you gave bread to a half-breed boy. Now you got all their old ones prowling your land like spirits." Ruth laid the coins on the counter. "Maybe they came because I treated their child like a person instead of a pest." The laughter stopped. The scarred man stepped closer. Or maybe you invited him. Women like you don't mind a little company, do they? Not since your husband went cold in the ground. The words hit harder than a slap, but Ruth only blinked once. Then, before she could speak, the door opened behind her. It was Ellen Parker, the dressmaker's wife, church elder, always wore gloves even in summer. She looked from Ruth to the men, then at the coins on the counter. With perfect calm, she picked up the bar of soap and dropped it back in the basket. She won't need that, she said coldly. Nothing she touches can be washed clean anyway. A silence fell so sharp it cut the air in half. Ruth left the store without her things. Her boots hit the dirt road like war drums. She didn't cry until she reached the edge of town, not because of the words, but because of how quickly they'd turned. Because once these were her neighbors. Once they brought casseroles when Jacob died. Now they looked at her as if she'd let poison drip from her well. She walked the long way home, through the grove behind Miller's Creek. The wind had picked up again. Trees bent slightly as though listening. When she reached the edge of her land, she saw it. 3 stones stacked neatly near the path, white, red, blue, like a message or a marker. She stopped and stared at them. It wasn't a threat. It was a memory. The same colors as the beads, the same shape as the charm. Someone had been there, not to harm, to honor. That night she didn't light every lantern. She let the dark come in and settle like an old friend. Because even if the world had turned its back on her, the woods had not. And in that silence she began to understand. She had done more than feed a starving boy. She had stepped across a line that couldn't be walked back. It was just past dusk when she heard the knock. Not a fist, not the frantic pounding of fear. Just 3 soft taps. Ruth stood still by the fire, one hand on the back of the rocking chair, the other wrapped around a steaming mug of chicory. The night had gone quiet again, like the woods were holding their breath. She opened the door slowly, her shawl already on her shoulders. And there he was, the boy, standing at the edge of the porch steps, face half lit by the lantern above the door. He wore the same hood, now soaked through, and in his arms, something heavier. Ruth stepped forward. It wasn't something, it was someone, a man. Slumped against the boy's small frame, tall and limp with exhaustion, bleeding from a deep gash in his side. His legs dragged the ground. His long, black hair clung to his face. His jaw was sharp, angular, with a dark beard and high cheekbones. His chest rose and fell shallowly beneath a deerskin coat soaked with both rain and blood. The boy looked up, lips tight. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Ruth stepped aside and opened the door wider. The boy guided the man inside, moving, with a strength that didn't belong to his size. They laid him down near the hearth where the fire had burned low. Ruth fetched blankets, herbs, boiled water. She didn't ask questions, she just worked. The gash along the man's side was clean but deep. Not fresh, no longer bleeding heavy, but not healing either. She could see where someone had tried to pack it with moss and bark. The work of a child, perhaps, or desperation. When she finished cleaning the wound and wrapping it tight, she looked at the boy. His eyes were heavy with fatigue, but he still didn't speak. Instead, he reached into a pouch at his side and pulled something out. A small bundle of rabbit meat, cooked, barely warm. He held it out to her. Ruth took it carefully. "You brought this for me?" The boy nodded once. Then he sat beside the man, curling against him like a pup seeking warmth. Ruth placed the food aside and stoked the fire. It wasn't until later, after the boy had fallen asleep and the man's breathing had settled into something steadier, that Ruth noticed the necklace, carved bone, bits of turquoise, and one long black feather. Same beads as before, same shape, same message. She leaned back against the wall and stared at the pair. The man didn't stir, but she knew he wasn't just some wanderer. He was someone the elders had trusted, someone the boy had brought from deep in the forest, someone who carried silence like a cloak. And Ruth, sitting in the soft orange glow of the fire, whispered to no one in particular, What kind of vow did I make without knowing? Outside, the wind rose again. But this time, it didn't sound like warning. It sounded like an answer. By morning, the boy was gone. Ruth found the door slightly ajar, the chill creeping in. The fire had died to embers, and the pallet beside the hearth was empty, except for the man. He hadn't left. He lay exactly as before, but his eyes were open now, sharp, alert, tracking her movement like a predator used to pain. Ruth froze, mid-step, holding a kettle of water. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. The man's gaze dropped briefly to the bandage at his side. He lifted the edge, inspected the wound, then glanced back at her with the barest of nods. Not approval, not thanks. Acknowledgement. He sat up slowly, every movement precise, quiet. When he stood, he towered over her, even weakened. But there was no threat in his presence. Just weight. Like something ancient that had decided to rest inside her walls for a while. Ruth found her voice first. "You shouldn't be standing." He didn't answer. Instead, he turned, stepped outside into the frosted light of morning and walked, limping, deliberate, toward the woodpile. The axe leaned against the stump, untouched since Jacob died. Ruth hadn't lifted it in over a year. She followed him to the doorway, wrapping her shawl tighter. "You don't need to." But he had already begun. The first swing was unsteady, the second smoother. By the third, he had settled into rhythm. She watched, speechless, as he split log after log, the muscles in his back tightening beneath the leather of his coat, the gash in his side wrapped but still red beneath the fabric. Every motion was effort, every breath, labored. But he didn't. Stop. When he finished, he stacked the pieces neatly beside the door, then returned to the yard and began repairing the fence post that had been leaning since the last storm, all without a word. That evening, Ruth made stew. She set 2 bowls on the table inside, one across from her own. The man didn't come in. Instead, he sat on the porch, facing the woods, sharpening a short blade with a stone. His movements were slow, meditative. Ruth stepped out and placed the bowl beside him on the step. "You should eat while it's warm." He looked at the bowl, then at her, and waited. She frowned, unsure, until it hit her. He wouldn't eat, until she did. So she returned inside, sat down, and took a bite. Only then did he begin. That night she dreamed of fire again, but this time the boy wasn't alone. The 3 elders stood behind him, silent as ever. And beside them, the man, his face unreadable but present, watchful. When she awoke, the sky was still dark, and he was outside, still seated, still awake, still guarding. Not as a guest, not as a prisoner, but as something else. Ruth didn't understand what bargain had been struck in the quiet of that night, what thread had been tied when she gave bread to a hungry child, but it was binding. This wasn't charity anymore. This was covenant, and he wasn't leaving. It was the chickens that woke her. Not a rooster's crow or restless pecking, but panic, squawking, wild and sharp, like something had broken into their world and didn't care to be quiet about it. Ruth sat up, breath caught in her throat. Then she smelled it. Smoke. She threw the blanket aside and ran to the window, her heart pounding so loud it drowned the silence of the night. Outside, the hen house glowed, not with lantern light, with fire. Flames licked the sides of the coop, reaching greedy fingers up toward the sky. The chickens inside screamed, high, shrill, desperate. Ruth didn't think. She ran barefoot across the cold wooden floor, yanked open the door, and burst into the night air. The wind hit her like ice, but the heat rising from the fire bit harder. She stumbled toward the coop, only half aware that her nightgown was dragging through the mud. A figure moved before her, fast, silent. It was him, the man she still didn't have a name for, the one who had taken up residence on her land like he'd always been meant to be there. He was already hauling a barrel of water toward the flames, muscles strained under his coat, breath heavy but steady. He didn't ask, didn't speak, just acted. She grabbed a bucket, but he waved her back sharply with one hand, never looking at her, just moving, focused, controlled. He kicked open the coop's back gate and disappeared into the smoke. She coughed, blinking against the heat, as sparks burst into the wind like angry fireflies. Then, one by one, the chickens scattered from the opening, feathers singed but bodies intact. He emerged last, coat over his face, a bird tucked under. One arm, a smoldering ember stuck to his sleeve. He dropped the chicken gently, then tore the coat from his back and beat down the edge of the fire with it, each blow sure, brutal, final. Only when the last flame hissed into the dirt did he stand still. They were alone in the glow of the ruin. Smoke curled toward the stars. Ash floated like snow. He turned, slowly, face streaked with soot. His eyes met hers. And what she saw there wasn't fear, it was fury, not wild, not loud. Cold fury, old fury. She took a shaky step forward. That wasn't an accident. He said nothing. She looked down at the scorched earth, the dying sparks, the broken door. They meant to scare me. He answered at last, low, grave. They meant to shame you, or break you, or worse. Her voice cracked. Because I helped your boy. Because you didn't apologize. The words cut sharper than any insult she'd heard in town. Ruth wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop the trembling. It's because you're here. They see you as a threat. He stepped closer, close enough for her to see the glint of blood beneath the ash on his sleeve. I am a threat, he said calm, to men who hate silence, who fear women who choose instead of obey. She swallowed hard. You should go. If you stay, they'll burn more than my coop. He looked down at the ground, then at her, then said, like it was, the only thing that mattered. I stay. Ruth stared at him. You stay why? His voice was soft, final. Because you didn't look away. The words hit her deeper than she expected. She didn't reply. She couldn't. So they stood there, in the cold silence after the blaze, surrounded by smoke and broken wood and the smell of fear that hadn't won. Later, they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets. She poured 2 mugs of weak coffee with shaking hands. He didn't speak, didn't drink until she did. The chickens huddled under the eaves, feathers ruffled, eyes wide. And Ruth stared into the black sky, heart thudding against her ribs. She knew something had changed, not just the damage to her land, but the shape of what lived between them. This wasn't about bread anymore. This was about fire, and what stays, standing after the flames. The morning after the fire, Ruth expected him to leave. That was the natural way of things, help given, debt settled, paths parted. But when she stepped onto the porch at dawn, he was already there. Kneeling by the way, ruins of the coop, sleeves rolled up, hands blackened with ash, sorting the charred boards into salvageable pieces, mending, rebuilding, as if he belonged. He didn't look at her, didn't explain himself, and she didn't ask. Instead, she brought him a tin cup of coffee and set it on the stump beside him. He nodded once, then drank. They worked side by side for most of the day, not as strangers, not as equals even, but as something stranger, something wordless. 2 people who had shared fire and silence and still chosen not to walk away. She swept the porch while he repaired the fence. She refilled the feed bins while he cleaned the troughs. He moved slowly, his wound still fresh beneath the new bandage she'd wrapped that morning. But he never complained, never stopped. That evening, she caught him near the well. He was sitting on the ground, legs crossed, carving something from a small block of wood. His blade moved in smooth, deliberate strokes like every cut already knew its place. She approached quietly. He didn't look up. She sat beside him in the dirt, close enough to see the shape taking form. Wings, narrow and stretched. The body of a hawk in mid-flight. For the boy? She asked. He shook his head. No. For who then? Still carving, he said. For you. She blinked, surprised. Why? You gave bread. A pause. He glanced at her, then added, And you shared it with no one watching. Ruth lowered her gaze to the carving. It was just a meal. He didn't answer, because they both knew it wasn't. Later, as the sun slipped behind the pines and shadows deepened, she found the finished carving on her windowsill. A small wooden hawk with wings spread wide, feathers etched with the patience of someone who didn't rush anything. Tied around its neck was a single bead, red, like the flame that nearly took the coop, and beneath it, a string of horsehair. A quiet offering, a seal. She cradled it in her palm and didn't know whether to cry or smile. That night she cooked cornbread, the good kind, made with the last of the buttermilk powder and real salt. When she served it, she placed 2 slices on his plate without ceremony. He didn't touch them until she took her first bite. Then he ate. And for the first time since he'd come, he spoke before she did. "My name," he said quietly, "is Tamahel." She looked up. It wasn't just a name, it was trust. She nodded, heart catching in her throat. "I'm Ruth." He didn't repeat it, but he didn't need to, because he'd already said it without words. In the fire he fought, in the carving he left, in the fact that he stayed. That night, after the lantern was out and the stars blinked through the window pane, Ruth held the wooden hawk in her hand as she lay in bed. And she thought, not of Jacob, not of town gossip, not even of fire. She thought of a boy who had come starving, and of the man who stayed behind, and how something as small as a piece of bread could ripple wide enough to reach the heart of a man who had long forgotten how to trust. The wind shifted that morning. It carried the scent of paper and dust, of something old being stirred up, something meant to stay buried. Ruth was in the loft, sorting through Jacob's old chest for nails and twine. The coop needed a new latch. Tamahel was already reinforcing the frame with cedar stakes. He worked with quiet rhythm, as always. She didn't expect to find the letter. It was tucked between a hymn book and a box of unused cartridges. The envelope was yellowed, brittle at the edges, addressed in Jacob's scrawl. "To Mr. Dalton Covey," it read. The blood drained from her face. She broke the seal with shaking hands and unfolded the single page inside. The ink had faded, but the words were clear. "I agree to the terms as discussed. The land and cabin will be transferred once Ruth is informed. Best to move quietly. She's stubborn, but I'll handle it. Jacob Candler." No date, no apology, no signature beyond his name. Ruth sat down hard on the floorboards, the letter trembling in her hands. He had planned to sell everything, the cabin, the trees, her life, without telling her, to Covey, the same man who stood at the center of every backroom deal in Grady Hill, the one who controlled half the property lines and wanted the other half. She felt the betrayal like a slap that came too late to stop. Downstairs, she could hear the creak of wood, Tamahel's calm hammering. The scent of pine resin drifted through the cracks. She should have told him, but instead she folded the letter back into its envelope and slid it into her apron. Later, as the sun stretched low, she stood beside him at the coop. "Covey's behind it," she said softly. Tamahel didn't pause in his work. "The fire? All of it. The threats. The watching. He's been after this land for years. I just didn't want to believe it." Now he stopped. He straightened, eyes meeting hers. "He sent men." She nodded. "He'll send more. And this time it won't be just for burning. A co-op." Tamahel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "He wants what feeds you." "What do you mean?" He looked toward the hills. "If he takes the land, he takes your root." She thought of the charm, the beads, the hawk on her windowsill. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the letter. "Jacob was going to give it to him," she whispered. "He signed a deal, all behind my back." Tamahel took the envelope gently, read it in silence. He handed it back without comment, but his jaw had tightened. "That's why they think I don't belong here," she said, "because even the man I shared a bed with didn't believe I had a right to stay." "You fed a child with no name," Tamahel said. "That gives you More claim than any man with a deed. She looked at him, blinking back something that wasn't quite tears. I don't want to run, she said. Then don't. His voice was quiet, certain, and for the first time since she found the letter, she believed she might not have. They summoned her with a letter nailed to her gate. No signature, just a line written in ink that bled from the damp. Grady's Hill Church, Sunday. Be there? Ruth read it once, then folded it without flinching. She knew what it meant. They weren't calling her to worship. They were calling her to answer. On Sunday, she wore the black dress Jacob had buried his father in. A dress meant for mourning, now worn for war. Her boots were scuffed, her hair pinned up, and she carried nothing with her but her hands open and empty. Tamahel did not ride with her. She hadn't asked him to. But when she turned the last bend in the road and saw the small wooden chapel rising on the hill, she felt him watching. Somewhere in the pines. A presence like a shadow draped in sunlight. The pews were already full when she arrived. Men and women who had known her for years, who had shared pies at socials, exchanged greetings after Sunday prayers. Now they looked at her as if she were something stained. The pastor stood at the altar, his Bible closed. He didn't smile. Ruth Candler, he said, not unkindly, we need to speak plainly. She nodded once. Then speak. Whispers flitted like moths along the walls. One man stood, Dalton Covey. He removed his hat with dramatic care. This woman, he said, has harbored outsiders, taken in one of them. She's put all of Grady's Hill in danger, and now she claims she has right to land that was promised to me, by her own husband. A ripple moved through the congregation. Ruth raised her chin. He promised what wasn't. His alone to give. Covey's eyes narrowed. He signed it, without filing, without witness, and before he died. She pulled the letter from her pocket, unfolded it with care, and held it up. This is a betrayal, not a contract. The pastor stepped forward, uncertain. Ruth, we're only trying to protect the town. From what? She snapped. A man who chops wood and eats in silence? From a child who nearly starved? Her voice rang through the wooden beams. The room fell still. Then, without warning, the back doors of the church creaked open, and Tamahel stepped inside. He didn't speak, didn't walk fast. He moved with the weight of mountains, each step slow, grounded. Gasps echoed. Some stood, some shrank back, but no one stopped him. He walked down the center aisle, past the rows of eyes that didn't know what to do with a man who didn't look afraid. When he reached the altar, he turned to face the crowd. She fed a hungry boy, he said. His voice was rough, deep. And you call it shame. Someone stood to protest, but Tamahel raised his hand, and the room froze. In my people, he said, we don't ask who a child belongs to, we ask who fed him, that is the answer. He turned to Ruth. And she is the answer. Then he left. Just like that. No threat, no plea, only truth. And in the silence that followed, no one dared speak, not even Covey. That night, Ruth returned home to find a bundle on her porch. 3 loaves of bread, still warm, left by no name, no knock, no witness. But she understood. Grady's Hill had seen her, and some of them had heard. The rain came 3 days later, soft at first like fingertips tapping on the roof, then heavier, sheets of it washing the dust from the porch planks, filling the cracks in the earth, turning the ash near the coop into rich, dark soil. Ruth stood barefoot on the steps, letting it soak the hem of her dress. The wind pulled strands of her hair loose, and she didn't bother to pin them back. Behind her, the door creaked open. Tamahel stepped out, quiet as ever. He didn't speak, only stood beside her. The rain didn't seem to touch him the same way. It slid off his shoulders like he belonged to it. She didn't turn. She just said, I thought it would feel different. After the church, what did you expect? He asked. I don't know, vindication, anger, something louder. He nodded. Storms end quiet. She breathed that in. Let the rain settle the last of the fear. I keep waiting to feel safe. Again, she murmured. Tamahel looked at her. Safety is not a feeling, it's a choice. She turned to face him, and something shifted in the space between them. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thin length of leather, wrapped around a carved piece of riverstone. It was worn smooth, etched with a symbol she didn't recognize, lines interwoven like vines. "This is for you," he said. "It means root, memory, that you are not alone." She took it carefully, the warmth of his hand lingering on the stone. "No one's ever given me something like this," she whispered. "You've given much," he said. Ruth looked down at the stone in her palm, then back at him. "I want you to stay." The words came out before she could doubt them, before she could question what it meant, what the town might think, what she might lose by saying it aloud. Tamahel didn't move, but his voice was steady. "I already have." She felt the tears rise, but didn't let them fall. Instead, she stepped forward and pressed her forehead gently against his shoulder. Not a kiss, not a promise, just presence. And he let her. Let the storm fall around them. Let the past fall away. That evening, as the sky broke open with light, and wind and thunder, Ruth placed the carved stone beside the wooden hawk on her windowsill. 2 offerings, 2 beginnings. The boy did not return, but sometimes she left bread on the edge of the fence anyway. The townspeople still watched her, still whispered, but their eyes no longer held the same judgment. And on some mornings, someone left eggs in a basket near her steps, or herbs or a strip of smoked meat. No words, just gestures. They would not love her loudly, but some of them maybe had begun to understand, and that was enough. Tamahel never slept inside, but he built a small shelter near the coop, half cabin, half stable, strong enough to hold through winter. He never asked for anything, never expected praise, but he always waited until she ate first. And every night before the lantern was blown out, he circled the perimeter of the land once, slow, watchful, not as a guard, as someone who belonged. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Ruth looked at him and asked, "Do you think they'll ever stop seeing me as the woman who fed a stranger?" He didn't look up. "No," she smiled. "Good." Because she didn't want to be forgotten. She wanted to be remembered for that. For bread given without permission. For kindness that broke the rules. For love that never asked for anything in return, until it was freely offered. The rain eased. The fire crackled low. And in the stillness, Ruth knew. Some storms come to destroy. Others come to make things grow. This one had done both.
Sometimes, all it takes is a piece of bread to change a life. Ruth didn't plan to start a war, earn respect, or find love. She simply chose compassion when no one else would. And in return, she discovered that silence can protect, loyalty can heal, and kindness leaves a mark deeper than fear ever could. Have you ever done something small that led to something greater? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. And if you believe in the quiet power of grace, strength, and redemption, subscribe to the channel for more tales like this one.